Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Last night, I went to see a production of Into the Woods at LaGuardia High School. If you know anything about LaGuardia Productions, they're essentially adolescent versions of Broadway-level shows, almost as good and way less expensive. And with one of our CBE teens playing the narrator, I thought it was a good excuse to go up there and luxuriate in the wholesome theatrical goodness of a high school production. Did not disappoint. If you've ever seen Into the Woods, you know it's full of variegated fairy tale subplots, but the basic arc hinges on the character of the baker, beginning with him and his wife struggling to conceive a child, and the baker grappling with the absence of his own father. It is a familial conflict that might as well have been lifted straight from the pages of Genesis. And no spoilers here, but the first act follows their quest to have a baby, which requires going into the woods, which is to say, going into the wild unknown, full of fear and questioning. And despite the fact that they do wind up with a child, the second act proves that the baker is still torn up and afraid even after getting what he wants and becoming a father. At one point, he even thinks about abandoning the child, because when things get real for him, he can't make up his mind. In one of the last numbers, he sings, "No more questions, no more tests. Comes the day you say, what for, please no more." The baker is totally hamstrung by uncertainty, ambivalence, and fear, and he becomes avoidant. For the Stephen Sondheim fans among us, you'll recognize that ambivalence is Sondheim's greatest obsession. Musing on marriage, he wrote the line, "You're always sorry, you're always grateful," in Company. And the character of Little Red in Into the Woods is famously excited, but as she says, excited and scared. Sondheim's third yard site is coming up in a week or so, and anyway, I can't resist being a theater freak with all of you. So I went there tonight, but I also chose to go there because ambivalence, that obsession of our modern prophet Stephen Sondheim, ambivalence is all too familiar in our own lives, holding competing values or desires inside ourselves. Deep uncertainty set against a very scary world filled with questions, rife with tests, is, in the words of another Sondheim classic, the experience of being alive. As a rabbi in this community, people don't often come to me with questions about keeping kosher. Wasn't really supposed to be a laugh line, but fine. They also don't ask if pushing their strollers on certain blocks might break the rules on Shabbat. But they do come with questions about their own ambivalence, about God, about Jewish practice, about their relationships, questions about being alive in the Sondheim sense. And throughout Parshat Vayishlach, we find the patriarch Jacob in a state of utmost aliveness and indeed ambivalence. You may recall that in last week's Parsha, he encountered God directly in a dream of a ladder up to heaven, filled with assurances that God would always be with him. But that only tells part of the Jacob story, because just a few weeks ago, we encountered him as a devious child, the object of parental mishigas, scheming an outcome he wanted by stealing his brother Esau's birthright. And maybe you also want to steal something from your brother. I can't quite tell, but that's the Jacob we remember from a few Torah portions ago. And he ran away in that episode, possibly in guilt or maybe just in fear of what his brother could do to him. Both memories are part of him, the Jacob of Toldot and the Jacob of Vayetze, the fearful and the faithful. Both are Jacob, and this conflict within himself is about to come to a head. Enter Vayishlach, where we find Jacob preparing to confront Esau this week for the first time as an adult. His messengers tell him that Esau is approaching with 400 men, and though the Torah usually shies away from telling us exactly what anyone feels, the text says, Vayira Yaakov me'od vayetzer lo. Jacob was greatly frightened and anxious. Frightened, according to Rashi, that he would be killed, and anxious that he might have to kill his brother. He isn't sure which. This doubling is echoed in what he does next, dividing his camp into two. Practically, he did this so that no matter the outcome of this encounter with Esau, some portion of his men would survive. But metaphorically, the divide of his camp mirrored the divide in his own subconscious. In his prayer to God, Jacob asks for protection for both of his camps, but he phrases it with a Freudian slip. Ve'ata hayiti lishnei machanot, which literally means, now I have become two camps. Hizkuni interprets this to mean that Jacob's very self is divided as he is overcome by fear. Should I do this, he wonders, or should I do that? Some of our commentators blame Jacob for being so afraid, arguing that maybe he shouldn't have even tried to reconcile with his brother, or that he should have not known to be afraid because God was with him. But in the 15th century words of Isaac Abarbanel, Jacob's fear of Esau was due not to the weakness of his faith, and he genuinely trusted in God. But his fear was like that of the real hero who, in going to battle, is afraid of death and senses danger, but out of noble motives chooses bravery instead. In other words, his fear was not because he didn't believe God was with him, but no matter how confident you might be that you are doing the right thing, you can still be a little afraid. Or, like the baker in Sondheim's score, you might have assurances from greater powers, but you might still doubt yourself. And it is in that state, that vulnerable, frightened human mode, that Jacob does what he's most famous for in this week's Parsha. He sends his family away, and Vayivater Yaakov levado, he is left alone. Vayevek ish imo, and a figure wrestled with him, ad alot hashachar, until daybreak. This is the moment, that famous scene when he wrestles with someone or something, possibly God, possibly Esau, or possibly himself. We don't exactly know. All we're certain of is that he enters that struggle completely, and he emerges on the other side transformed. He is renamed Israel because, as we know and as we read, he struggled with beings divine and human, and he prevailed. A moment later, Jacob looks up and sees Esau, a fact that links his wrestling with his brother. The text no longer refers to his fear, but we know he still feels it since he still divides his family before meeting his brother. And in short order, Esau approaches him and kisses him, and they weep together. The worst possible outcome never materializes. At the end of the scene, they part ways, and the text says, Vayavo Yaakov Shalem, Ir Shechem. Jacob arrived safely in the city of Shechem. And the word safely more literally translates to he arrived whole, or in one piece. The Sfat Emet explains this to mean that after the wrestling and after the reconciliation, Jacob had finally integrated different parts of himself into himself, possibly the parts of himself that he was previously avoiding, or the parts that were in conflict with one another. It's not to say that he was no longer afraid, but rather that he understood his fear as an integral part of his being, and that he was able to address it, if not conquer it, and pass through to a deeper awareness of himself. Put differently, Jacob was successful not because he overcame his fear, but because he accepted it and did not let it define him. For any of us who feels afraid at times, facing uncertainty in our personal lives or afraid as we think about what the next year or years might bring, it is hopefully moving that in our spiritual DNA is not necessarily an example of conquering fear, so much as an invitation to move through it. It's not the courageous example of other mythologies, many of which we can't emulate anyway, but rather a more realistic interior wrestling with fear, because avoiding our fear will never get us to where we think it will. Jacob needed to confront his fears more than he needed to vanquish them. There was no other way for him to be honest with himself and to finally pursue his destiny, which required going there into the unknown, into the woods, if you will. Someone once told me that in order to find deeper meaning within fairy tale subplots of Into the Woods, you have to imagine that every time someone speaks of the woods, they're spelling it W-O-U-L-D-S. Changes the meaning a little bit. It means, therefore, that to enter the fearful wild is to enter a space of what would be, or what you would do, existing in a conditional or subjunctive mood, not knowing precisely what will be, and living with a little fear of many different potential paths. Being alive requires existing in that subjunctive. And perhaps then, what it means to be Israel is to acknowledge that fact, choosing to confront our desires and fears, wrestling with them instead of avoiding them, and to come out on the other side as whole beings, hopefully better, more secure, but certainly more balanced and more alive. Shabbat Shalom.